You're listening to SiriusXM Insight. This is Tell Me Everything with John Fugelsang.
It's a pleasure, Professor Warren, to have you join us, and I do hope that if this goes well, we can get you here in person in the studio sometime, because it's a really powerful book, and sometimes it's easy to despair that it seems like the people asking these questions are the same ones who always ask these questions, and other people are just content to call the less fortunate lazy, and that they are less fortunate because they don't work as hard and they deserve it. We are still very much living in the echoes of slavery, in the after effect of Reconstruction, and Jim Crow set up a system that we are still trying to overcome. And by we, I mean those of us with empathy. For all too many are rather indifferent to this, but you write in the book that as of 2014, 67% of black children are born into single-parent households compared to 25% of white children, 42% of Hispanic children, 53% of Native American children. We're going to be going into a lot of statistics in this conversation, and I'm grateful for them. But let me start off with, the broad question. What was it that inspired you and your co-authors to really take on the data on all these damning statistics?
Well, it's because we're data nerds, and I love numbers, and I think it's important when we have these conversations in some ways to depersonalize it, because any conversation about race is very difficult for us in this country. And when we tend to talk about it as, oh, that person is racist or that person is not, and we miss what we call the racial rules. So what are the rules or the policies that structure opportunities differently for blacks or whites or Latinos or Asians or Native Americans? And we really wanted to combine the rules that are not the personal one-on-one forms of racism, but we needed to also attach the data to them. So that's what the overall framework of the book is about. It's about the policies and the rules that structure opportunity and that have excluded, in this case, blacks for many generations. But when we talk about the rules, there's something we can do about them, because we can always change the rules to make them more inclusive.
Exactly.
We also wanted to not depress everybody with the book. There's lots of data and numbers, as you say, but by the end of the book, we try to promote a vision of how we can change the rules to make sure this country is inclusive for everybody.
I'd love to talk about how we can change the rules, because we talk a lot about it on this show. And obviously, Ava DuVernay's excellent documentary of last year, 13th, shows how slavery is still very much alive and well, especially in our prison system. And when African Americans are disproportionately incarcerated at record high rates, where they're allowed to then go work for free for corporations while the rest of us subsidize their room and board and health care, it's a long-standing racket. One of the great moments of Barack Obama's second term occurred in the last year when he canceled the government's contract with private prisons. I've long maintained any society that keeps on building more private prisons is a society that keeps on needing more crime. We've already seen, of course, the Jeff Sessions Justice Department overturn that, and it looks like Jeff Sessions will have his dream come true of turning the drug war up to 11 and incarcerating untold new numbers of nonviolent African-American male drug offenders, which speaks directly to the statistics of African-American children born to single-parent households. When you have an institution of locking up black men for nonviolent drug offenses, you're going to have broken families across the country.
That's right. And so that's going to structure the opportunity. We know that kids do better in households that are not in poverty and that have at least two parents. Hey, my brother lives in a family with three parents. So, there are lots of different ways we can structure households, but we know that kids do better in households with more than one parent working. And so we have the data to suggest that mass incarceration has had a disproportionate effect on black kids because, as you said, the fathers aren't around. But here's also the wrinkle to, as you were talking about mass incarceration, what Jeff Sessions and the Justice Department is doing in terms of the war on drugs. A lot of the laws that have locked people up, and especially black people, in the 80s and 90s, when we had that crack cocaine epidemic, especially in urban America, that really locked up a generation of black men. But here's the thing, John. I was just in Ohio a few months ago and talking to some community organizers there, and they told me that the highest rates of incarceration now are rural white women. Why? The opioid epidemic, the heroin epidemic, and the laws on the books that were geared towards or targeted towards African-American communities are now capturing white people too. And so I like to say racism harms black people and people of color, but racism also harms white people too.
Absolutely.
They are getting caught in the net of these rules that were enacted for a different purpose, but with new conditions, with this incredible crisis that thankfully we're having a conversation about opioid addiction. It is capturing white people too. And so it creates the groundswell for change, because if we can forge a coalition between blacks and whites and Latinos and Asians around some of these rules that unfairly disadvantage all of us, then we can that's a formula for change.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. My friends, the African American female comedy duo Frangela, do a whole routine about the collapse of the middle class, where they say y'all are black too now. And when you look at these white women being incarcerated for the opioid crisis, you kind of realize, oh, this is how a system perpetuates itself, because now those women who are locked up, who could be out raising their children, working, paying taxes into our Social Security system, no, they're locked up. We're paying for their health care. We're paying into the $75 billion a year mass incarceration racket. Who's raising their kids? The answer, nobody. So when those kids are a little bit older, we'll be able to put them in the prisons and keep the system going.
And as you say, think of all, we're having a debate about so-called tax reform right now in this country. Think of all, as you just pointed out, think of all the tax revenue that we are missing out on now because people are locked up and not working. Or when people, by the way, get out of prison or jail, if you have a criminal record, it is much harder to get a job. Employers don't like to hire you. So what do we do about the folks that are either in prison now who could be paying taxes, or once they get out, they can't find jobs and therefore are not paying taxes, and then have to resort to other means of survival, the drug trade, for instance.
Exactly.
Right? Just to make ends meet, and then end up back into the prison system or the criminal justice system.
And the underground economy winds up being an essential portion of our criminal justice system, our legal system, and a lot of people make a lot of money off of locking up people for nonviolent drug offenses.
That's right. That's right. And it leads to, as you started the conversation, I'm really fascinated by the book that you were just talking about, In the Shadow of Slavery, because it is related to the broader question of wealth. And as you pointed out, there's only $5 roughly of black wealth for every $100 of white wealth. And it really gets to the concept, I think Barry Switzer famously said, lots of people are born on third base but go through life thinking they hit a triple.
Mm-hmm.
That's what wealth is, right? Some people are born on third base. Others can't even get to first base. Some people strike out. Other people can't even get to play the game. So wealth is important because it is both insurance and it's about being able to take risk. It allows you to fall back on tough times and be resilient if you have some wealth, whether it's in your home or savings. But it allows you to take risk, right, around education or starting a business or buying a home or transmitting it to your children.
Exactly.
And so the racial wealth gap is really, really – we talk about income a lot, as you mentioned. We don't talk about the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, which is really important for us to fix.
Well, what are ways that people can begin fixing it on a societal level? I mean, obviously, if we wait for the politicians to do it, it's never going to get done.
Well, we got to get them to do something too.
Well, sure.
But there are a couple things. One is we know I know you were talking about slavery and Reconstruction, but if we come to the 20th century, there were a set of rules built in the New Deal that a lot of us think created the American middle class in the 20th century. But what was embedded in the New Deal were some exclusions that ended up excluding black people, and especially around home ownership. So there was something called redlining, where black neighborhoods weren't eligible for credit or lending. The Federal Housing Administration discriminated against blacks while it was promoting suburbanization. So we fought back in the 60s. We had a whole thing called the Civil Rights Movement, you might remember. Although we were both really young then. But
I was old enough, I remember.
Yeah, I'm afraid I wasn't around yet, but I had a history teacher who worshipped MLK for a dad, so I tried to catch up.
I'm so old I remember the Underground Railroad.
Oh, ouch. Well, we did something before. We wrote the rules differently. We had something called the 1968 Fair Housing Act that was passed right after Dr. King's death, in fact. We had something called the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act, both efforts to rewrite the rules to encourage lending into black neighborhoods and the black community. So that was one example of how we change the rules to make them more inclusive.
And again, that's something, as you pointed out already, and I want to hit this point over and over again in this conversation, that helped Caucasians too. I mean, fighting poverty helps everybody.
That's right. But here's the thing. There's some racially exclusive rules. You might think of Jim Crow, right, in terms of who gets to vote. Do you have the right to vote, or are you excluded from the system? But then we also have an area we call non-rules, where it's just like you could do anything, right? So this is the case in the banking system in terms of what we experienced in the last financial crisis. In the 90s and 2000s, we deregulated the banking system, and it allowed for predatory lending and what people call reverse redlining.
Yes.
So subprime loans became a huge business, went from $20 billion in 1993 to $625 billion in 2005. And poor people were targeted. Blacks and Latinos were especially targeted. So 7% of whites had subprime loans in 2005, but 55% of blacks and 49% of Latinos did. So we have to rewrite the rules again to really rein in the wild, wild west around how banks target poor people and especially poor people of color for these predatory loans. We need to rewrite the rules again to prevent that from happening.
Our guest is Professor Dorian Warren, who you might know from MSNBC. He is the co-author of the essential new book, The Hidden Rules of Race, Barriers to an Inclusive Economy. And we're taking your calls here at SiriusXM Insight at 877-974-7487. That's 877-9-SIRIUS. And Professor Warren, you write in the book how we will show how neoliberalism is a belief system, an economic theory that was both fueled by and reinforces structural racism and racial rules. Now, we like to brag in this country that our free market system is race neutral. And we have race-neutral economic policies in this country, and that's how it should be because we're all even and we're all equal, and you can't have economic policies that favor one race, which gives lie to the fact that this country was founded on very, very race-specific economic policies. And this country was built not on race-neutral economic policies, but on an economic system that persecuted and punished and enslaved one particular race. So when you look at it, it's really quite simple to see how, the system itself seemingly has been designed to disfavor black Americans by having a racially oppressive economic system and then suddenly pretending we're race neutral and everything's fine. It gets back to the lie of we all started at the same starting line.
Well, when you add up the years, 250 years of rules of slavery and bondage, right? So if you're a slave, you are defined as property, therefore you cannot own property, right? It's kind of a simple proposition. So 250 years of the rules of slavery and bondage, and then another 100 years of Jim Crow, where black folks, especially in the South, didn't have rights of citizenship, couldn't vote, and couldn't get access to good jobs. So you add that up, that's 350 years. We've only had about 50 years of what we would call freedom, right? Of racial equity. So it's not exactly, it goes back to the Barry Switzer quote, right? So some people were born on third base, and that's fine, the accident of fate, right? Some people just get lucky. But for those that weren't, for those that were born on first base, we have to at least acknowledge that and then figure out how do we either allow more people to get into the game, or how do we change the rules of the game to make them more fair? And that's really what the book is about.
I want to ask you, Professor, also about now that I look at it, it's amazing how much our current administration is showing the historical after effects in full view, because we have a president who, as a real estate professional, was actually sanctioned by the Nixon Justice Department for being too racist. And when Nixon says that you and your dad are too racist, you're really doing something wrong. But you do cover in the book real estate lending practices and how that has been another method where institutionally or just culturally, African Americans have continually been denied equal access to housing.
Housing, wealth, and wealth. Most of our wealth in this country is through the homes that we are able to buy and own. That's how we built the middle class. Unlike the rest of the world, frankly, that's one of the best things about the country, right? In terms of figuring out how to build in opportunity for a broad range of people in a multiracial democracy. That hasn't applied to everybody. And so because most of our wealth is tied up in housing, if you can't have access to good housing or neighborhoods, you're at a disadvantage. So what must we do I'm not saying we should, throw everybody together in, certain neighborhoods by the law of government, but we do have to figure out ways to open up opportunities so that people can move, right, from maybe a low-income neighborhood to a middle-income neighborhood, or if you get lucky, to a high-end neighborhood, and not have it be 100% white or 100% black. So we have to figure out this question around desegregation. I'm not going to say integration, but desegregation, and making sure everyone has the same opportunity when it comes to being able to own a good home and have property values rise year over year instead of decline.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, Jim Crow going in until the 1960s. I in recent years have just been using the term apartheid more than Jim Crow. And I guess in looking at it, how do we begin as a culture when it seems like more than half the population denies these disparities even exist?
Well, I like I said earlier, I think it's important to point out how racism affects not only black people and people of color, but affects all of us. So to give you another example, since Jim Crow is, I think, in our historical memory, the most visible elements of that were the exclusions on voting in the South. So we had this thing called the poll tax, where you had to pay to vote. We had literacy tests where you had to be able to read some obnoxious, made-up jargon around the Constitution that wasn't probably factual.
Yep.
Those things excluded lots of black people, but by the way, they also excluded lots of poor white people too. So what does it mean? So I just want to make the case, or make the argument, that a lot of these racial rules that have been meant to exclude black people have also ended up excluding white people as well. And so if we were to draw the circle of community and of citizenship a little larger to include all of us, if we include black people in our democracy and in our economy, we all benefit. I want more black people to work, right? So that they can be paying taxes. Then we wouldn't have a deficit right now, even though we're about to make it bigger based on this tax. Sorry to get to another issue there.
No, that's fine. Please, that's how we roll on this show.
Oh, good. But I mean, the basic point is, if we look at every single domain, whether it's income or wealth or criminal justice or voting rights or housing, there are disparities everywhere, and the data in the book is overwhelming. But also, in addition to affecting black people, it is also hurting all Americans. And can we imagine a society where we all have equal opportunity and are all contributing? Because actually the economy will grow faster if more and more people were able to contribute, if more and more people were able to be employed and pay taxes and buy goods and services. And, by the way, work at a living wage, right, and not work for under $15 an hour, for instance. So if we have the policies, we have the rules that we know are inclusive. It's a matter of political will, and that's why it's so important to begin the conversation like we're doing now.
And it may take more poor white people to realize they have more in common with poor black people than they do with rich white people. I have a number of questions, including about voter ID laws and the fact that your book is not just analyzing problems. You and your co-authors dare to offer practical solutions. But I want to take a call from Randy in Arizona. Randy, welcome. You're on SiriusXM Insight with the co-author of The Hidden Rules of Race, Professor Dorian T. Warren.
Thanks. I was just back to your comment about mortgage lending, predatory, and you mentioned banks, and I'm a bank examiner. There is no federally insured bank who could get away with that. Mortgage companies that are non-bank owned, finance companies that are non-bank owned, that aren't regulated, banks cannot get away with that. They would get dechartered, they would get fined. It's not happening in the banking world. In the mortgage world that aren't owned by banks, sure. And these finance companies, that charge 25, 30%, they can get away with that crap, but banks can't. Just wanted to point out that differentiation. Thanks.
Well, Randy, I mean, that's that. Oh, well, you hung up. I mean,
Randy's right. Randy's right. I think that's right in theory, but the thing about all our laws is there's the laws on the books and then there's whether they're enforced. And there were many banks that did get away with it because we know already, Wells Fargo, for instance, settled for multiple millions of dollars with the city of Baltimore, who sued the bank to say you were doing these practices that are illegal on paper, but no one's enforcing the law. and we're going to come at you and sue you. And actually, Wells Fargo settled because of their racial discrimination in lending.
That's
and the
correct.
predatory lending they have been doing.
Yeah, the rules are there, but we all know that
the rules are there.
they find ways around. And again, this sort of bank scrutiny is historically a somewhat recent enterprise. I mean, banks have had many, many years to perpetuate these inequalities.
That's right. And as I mentioned, it's recent in our history that we actually rewrote the rules to try to prevent banks from doing this. And then in the 90s, we actually deregulated some of the banking industry because we thought that'd be better. But it actually led to something in 2007 and 2008 that was not good for all of us in terms of the crashing of our economy.
So let me shift to solutions, because you and your co-authors propose a number of racially inclusionary ideas that are actually possible if we got enough people on board. How do we as a culture, considering that it's got to be a people's movement before the politicians catch on, how do we begin including Caucasians who are aware enough to realize that helping African Americans is in their own self-interest, the way that helping poor people is good for rich people too? How do you recommend folks begin?
So, John, the first way is to have these conversations like we're having now. We got to at least talk about it. And happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Now is the perfect time to have those really awkward conversations at the Thanksgiving table with your family, right? Talk about not just, those people over there are maybe hurt by discriminatory laws or actions by employers, but actually start with your own experience. I think we all have experiences across race of unfairness and injustice in the world. So it's always useful, I find, to start with, okay, what's happening in your life? What do you think are the rules, whether it's at work or in your community, that are affecting you? And then broaden the conversation out to think, okay, well, how might my fate be linked to others? So in this case, if you were going to mention, I think earlier, voter ID laws.
Yes, sir. There's a hidden rule of race.
That's one great example where on the face of it, it's racially neutral, where it doesn't seem it's about race. It's just about, hey, do you have the ID necessary to vote? On the other hand, it is definitely geared towards trying to prevent a group of folks from getting access to the voting booth. And it has racially disparate effects, meaning it disproportionately affects black voters, it disproportionately affects poor people, it disproportionately affects older voters, it disproportionately affects students on college campuses who want to vote where they are often. So how do we think about changing the rules, and through first conversations with our families and our friends and our communities, and then we can begin to take action. So it can be simply signing a petition. It can be simply being online and looking at, I work a lot with both Move On and Color of Change, which are constantly educating people about the hidden rules of race and engaging people in ways they can take action. But we have to build the political will. We have to look, we outnumber the politicians, right? That's what the voting system is all about. That's what democracy is all about.
Mm-hmm.
It's about us as a people being able to foster our own fates and our own futures. And so if we can have enough conversations with enough people not like us and come up with collective solutions. Look, I have some in the book, but I don't have the only solutions. There are lots of other people with great ideas. Can we then start presenting them to our elected officials? Or in some cases, I encourage some of my friends to run for office themselves to change the rules. But we outnumber the politicians. We can create the political will to change the rules at the local level, the state level, and ultimately at the national level if we are daring enough to have these courageous conversations first about really difficult topics like race.
Well, your book goes deep, and it's deeply, deeply well-sourced as well. And if you're looking to understand better the racial rules that do determine all these dramatically unequal outcomes in terms of education and wealth and how the criminal justice system treats you, I highly recommend The Hidden Rules of Race. But before I let you go, Professor Warren, I got to ask, it's Thanksgiving. What are you optimistic about?
Oh, well, besides the deep fried turkey my brother's going to make. I'm actually, I know it's good, right? I'm optimistic actually that a year after the 2016 election, I think a lot of us are having these more difficult conversations. We are actually waking up, or as the term goes, people are getting woke, right? And are having conversations and discussions about the future of this country in a way that we haven't had them before. They're a bit too polarized, and we still have to cross the divide. but we are talking more, we are listening more, and I'm actually optimistic that this is a moment of reckoning for this country and potential realignment around our linked fates. We have to have a conversation about how we're all in this together and say no to the folks that attempt to divide us. And so I'm actually really optimistic that a year after November 2016, even if it feels like we're all trying to survive, even if it feels like there's a lot of hate in the world, we are actually having the courageous, hard conversations in a way that we were not having last year or the year before, the year before.
I have to agree, and I want to thank you and your co-authors for writing a book that covers causes and solutions. The book is The Hidden Rules of Race, Barriers to an Inclusive Economy, written by Professor Dorian T. Warren, along with Andrea Flynn, Susan Holmberg, and Felicia J. Wong. Thank you so much for joining us, and please, will you come join us in the studio sometime?
Absolutely. I would love that.
We'd love to get you here in person. Thank you, Professor.